the kind of strategies that I've learned as a very straight up trained historian. That's where I did undergrad, grad school, all of these degrees in history. And I have to tell you, they are not thinking about communities in our training, right? The way that they train us is what we call really top down, right, to do this work. And kind of the journey that I've taken to kind of think like, why did I really want to become a historian? Why did I want to write the book, right, that I wrote? And it was because what I figured out is that I actually really just want to help my community. I don't know, I like all the other stuff. I like teaching and I like researching, but the whole point was that I'm, Mexican from Grand Rapids, and I was hoping that the book that I wrote would be about, would be able to help my community in some way. And I've kind of taken this journey where I've written a book. It came out in 2023, and it became really clear to me that maybe the book was actually not accessible to my family, my friends, and the community that I really wanted to have access to it. It's 205 pages. I mean, I love it. It's necessary, right? My labor of love. But when my family was like, and is there an audiobook or Cliff Notes or a shorter version we could get? I was like, oh yeah, I don't think my work is done. Actually, I think my work has just begun. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I approach this, and then some work that we've done with one of my most amazing collaborators, who is here, Nora Salas. We'll hear from her later, but I want to talk about the different collaborations that I've taken to do this, and hopefully you can see from this that you can play a role in this. You can do your own public history, grassroots community engaged project too. I even have a worksheet for this. I can't help it. I'm a teacher, but I got cool pens to make it work. So we'll do workshop. I want to say a couple things about how I approach this, and then what we are doing in Grand Rapids, and then we'll get to kind of workshopping and hopefully maybe connecting folks with other folks in the room. So that's the overview that we talked about that I just kind of gave there. So as Michelle was saying, I don't know if you noticed, I have many jobs at Michigan State University. We always joke you have to have at least two, and I think I have at least 2 to 3 or 4-ish. But all of them kind of center on from being from the professor aspect, the researcher and the writer in the book, and being in Chicano Latino Studies, my position within the Dean's team and Women of Color initiatives at MSU, all kind of stem from making places. Right, making spaces for people to be able to belong at these institutions. Because the way that I looked at it as somebody who's born and raised in West Michigan, always kind of being asked so where are you really from? Right, was a signal to me that somebody didn't think I belonged actually in Michigan. That there was some way that I maybe was not belonging in the same way that they saw themselves. Right? It didn't matter if my parents were born in Michigan, my grandmother was born in Michigan, it was still a constant where are you really from? And the same things would happen inside academia, which is an institution, we're going to talk a lot about cultural institutions and academic institutions today, where it was kind of you're the professor, you're the associate dean, and I'm okay, we're still running into this at, desde chiquita, since I was little, people would come and, I remember being asked very young what my nationality was, and not knowing, at that point I knew I'm Mexican. That's what I knew, right? I didn't have a sense of what nation or any of that meant. And so all of the positions in the work that I've undertaken is about, how do we change this narrative? How can we make it so that what if we recenter, right, the ideas about belonging to be actually more inclusive? And so public history projects are just one extension of this work. And I really feel like a combination of all of the work that I've been doing and thinking about how do we change structures, how do we make systems more inclusive, and then how do we do it with the people who are the most affected by it. So I want to just briefly mention a couple of different entry points, because this is kind of maybe the nerdiest part of this whole thing, I promise, that there's a couple of schools of thought or theories about belonging that I really am interested in, and why I'm interested in public history in the way that I am. And so this is a quote from an article from South Asian archivists and librarians who are creating collections on South Asian communities, noticing that there is not any of them across the nation, that all of them are working in different places, and they started to make a digital collection together. But one of the things that they referenced was this idea of symbolic annihilation that was actually taken from the feminist movement, and they've applied it to their situation. And it's basically, this is what happens when members of marginalized groups, when they're absent, grossly underrepresented, maligned, or trivialized by mainstream television programming. So it's about media, but they took it, like these South Asian scholars have taken it to talk about archives and libraries. And so what happens to our communities if we have no records, if we have no ways to honor and preserve their legacies and histories? And so I'm thinking about why it's so important for us to do this work, right? Is what happens to our histories if we don't have a way to memorialize them and to engage them. I also draw really heavily from Black feminism and women of color feminism, these different theories that basically both, I won't go into too much detail, but there's the Combahee River Collective was a group in the 1970s of Black women who were navigating the Black Power movement and trying to find space for themselves as Black Power and a lot of our nationalist movements, Chicano nationalism, were really heavily men-led and men-centered. And so Black women were trying to find a place for themselves as some of the most marginalized people in society. And what they noticed is if you are to get rid of, the structures and the systems of oppression that hurt Black women, we can actually help everybody. And so I think, when I'm thinking about how we're doing public history projects is, how do we make them accessible? How do we help the most marginalized people be seen and have a voice? And then how does that actually help everybody? And then I also think about women of color feminism a lot with this. Because one of the things that women of color is just, this word, this term that we hear a lot that has come to mean, women who are not white, who are all in a group together. But what some of the kind of founders of this field and thinking about it had to say about it is that, we're not just born and put into a category, that actually you become women of color. And what they mean is that you have to choose solidarity with other people. And that's what I'm taking from this, that we're choosing solidarity with other people, and we're choosing, this is not something that comes easy. It's something that we continually have to do, and we continually have to engage with one another and learn one another's histories to be able to be in solidarity with them, right? So this is not just like, oh, this is my partner, this is my ally. There is a continual process that has to happen, and that's something that we should be thinking about. So I wrote this book on Mexican and Puerto Rican Grand Rapids, and it's split into these three parts: migration, placemaking, and activism. And I just want to tell you a little bit about it to put into context the public history project that has emerged since then, right? And so I talk, the first part of the book looks at why people from Mexico, from Texas, and Puerto Rico would leave those places. And this is also, this was a part of my own understanding, because I kept thinking, why? Not, if I don't belong here, then where do I belong? And after visiting Mexico and Puerto Rico as a kid, being like, well, why did we end up in Michigan? Especially in the winter time, right? I know what it was like in the winter in other places now. Why did we end up here? And what I found, right, as other scholars have also found, right, that this dates back hundreds of years that led groups on this trajectory, right? Imperialism, colonialism, racial violence, economic displacement, all of these things made it hard, right, for people to stay where they're at, and they chose, right, to migrate as a term, as a way to survive. And so this project is also very, I'm a part of this community, and so I offer you photos of my family. It's music pointer. This right here is my dad's family when they first moved to, this is a couple years after they moved to Grand Rapids. My dad was born here, and half of his siblings were. So it's probably like the 1960s, and then down here is my great-grandmother, who was, her and her husband were recruited to work on sugar beet fields in the 1920s in Michigan. And they had their kids, my grandma here, and her siblings, right in Saginaw. And so this is a part of larger trajectories of recruitment and migration, both from companies and from the state. And so I show this map here in that bottom corner of the places that folks were going, Mexican Americans, Tejanos in particular, were going in the second half of the harvest season. And you can see they're going all around the country, but they're also going, a lot of folks are coming to the Midwest into Grand Rapids. And that comes from a book called Tejano Diaspora by an author named Mark Rodriguez. And up in the upper corner, I didn't know I was going to have to use this so much. It's so exciting to show. Thank you. Up in that corner, there's a newspaper article, right? A newspaper article about Puerto Ricans who were recruited to come to the United States through a very state-sponsored program in the 1950s. And if you read Spanish, right, you know that they didn't have a good experience here, right? That they described horrors in the fields. And that many Puerto Ricans found what Mexicans and Tejanos and Braceros had found, and that the Michigan fields were hard places to work because of the unequal treatment, the poor pay, the kind of exploitative conditions, where many people found that they ended up owing their employer money because they were charged for room and board and water and food that many found inadequate. So this led people to migrate right to other places, and Grand Rapids is one of those places, including Detroit and Chicago, and just people leaving altogether from the state. But that's where my family ended up both converted to Grand Rapids, as did many other families at the same time. And then the next part of the book goes over placemaking, and this is really something that's very exciting to me because considering how people came to Grand Rapids and then what they found in Grand Rapids, like this very black, white, racially dichotomous city, like you're either black or you're white. Native people are relegated to like non-belonging altogether. Where do multiracial people like Mexicans and Puerto Ricans fit in? Right to this, and it was really confusing for the locals who ultimately decided most of these folks are non-white and not acceptable, and very hard in particular for Afro-Latinos who were experiencing the same type of segregation that Black folks were facing, but also did not speak English, so hard to build relationships with African Americans at the time. And so I really was interested in, okay, so how do people make belonging in this type of environment? And a lot of it centers on joy, on hanging out, on, I was joking with the salseros out there, a lot of this is dancing together and cooking together and not even working alongside, but going to church together. And so I look at spaces of recreation, of religious gatherings, some churches that people were a part of, as well as other things like house parties. I love studying house parties. It's amazing to look at people's pictures and see. I love the idea that, I come from a long line of women who got dressed up to sit in the sala, to sit in the living room for a party, right? That's amazing. And then I love festivals as well, because festivals offer this kind of temporary belonging in very public spaces. A lot of these things are private, right? They're in backyards, they're in basements, they're in living rooms, they might be in dance halls. They might be a park as a more public space, but festivals become this really public space, right? Where you kind of take over downtown, these spaces that are really governmental, that are really kind of administrative, and they're these like 3 days of belonging, right? So these are really, really interesting to kind of combat the narrative, right? That these are just laborers here that can be exploited and taken advantage of. Instead, these are people who are making a space for themselves in Grand Rapids and transforming Grand Rapids at the same time. I look at placemaking entries through activism, right? So how did organizations, grassroots organizations, change the places around them? And so I talk about the Latin American Council for West Michigan, which started in the 1960s and was a contemporary of La UP. Right, the group started at the same time. They were very much started for the same purposes, that a lot of the kind of social services that folks were entitled to have access to as residents, as people who were living in this area, were not accessible because there wasn't anybody who was speaking Spanish, and other issues with racism and discrimination. And so organizations like La UP and the Latin American Council started to create their own social safety nets for people, oftentimes in buildings, in houses, turned into organizational centers. They created their own unemployment program, but also social, like food drives, clothing drives. That's a place that if you needed help, you could go and get it there. But they also did a lot of cultural awareness, right? This was a time for kind of really pressure for assimilation during the Cold War, that if you wanted to be accepted in Grand Rapids, you would have to kind of get rid of all of your cultural markers, which of course, cultural and racial markers are a part of that. You can't really get rid of your racial markers. So much so that this community center was so active, they were also a base for activism, which included suing the city of Grand Rapids for discriminatory hiring policies. And this is how we get kind of our first Latino firemen, Latino police, people who work at the city government, because up until the 1970s, really there weren't any Latinos in these positions except for janitorial positions. So they weren't really, the city of Grand Rapids and its resources weren't really accessible. And then I end the book with gentrification. And I kind of frame gentrification as like the undoing of the placemaking. In particular, I look at Granville Avenue in Grand Rapids, where this place that has like a long history of Latinos, other folks as well have also lived here. Black folks have been in the neighborhood. It was a place that early Mexican Americans and Mexicans lived in. They lived in kind of the most industrial neighborhoods next to Black folks who were coming up from the first and second Great Migration. The Eastern European immigrants, before they kind of transitioned into whiteness, all shared these spaces. And then after World War II, as white folks were moving out to Wyoming, the suburb of Grand Rapids, more Latinos and African Americans had access to this neighborhood, alongside some poor white folks, or white folks who just didn't want to leave, right? But they were also there. And so I look at Granville Avenue and then the effects of what happens with coming gentrification. So one thing that I think is a real visual example of this is Founders Brewery, which I feel like most people know, right? Founders Brewery is down the street from this area. And if that tells you anything, right, that there was change coming once they came in, and there has been a lot, right? There's been a lot. And so I spent a lot of time talking to Steph Rosales, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her later, but she's the CEO of Granville Avenue Arts and Humanities, a grassroots organization that serves this community, about this gentrification and what was happening and the ways that neighbors were resisting gentrification and at least understanding, right, the effects that were coming with it and trying to prepare. And so that's kind of the arc of the book and where the public history kind of stuff starts. I just want to mention briefly this framework, because I want to also hope that you can better understand as a historian and as a professor. Like, I have an obligation to continue to research at my university. I wrote the book and I'm so happy, but I teach at a research intensive university, so they're like, that's wonderful. Where's your next book? I'm like, oh my God, I just spent 10 years writing this book. You're like, you want another book? Oh my God. So there was a lot of pressure at my university, like, to produce that. And it's really hard because I'm like, I want to work with my community, which is actually another form of research and production, right? That my university is not actually seen oftentimes, right? That we don't privilege, we don't see work with community as at the university as the same as writing a book or writing a journal article, which is really troubling because our universities, especially my university, is a land-grant institution. As problematic as that is, but we have a charge, right, to help our communities and to be engaged with our communities. But I'm in college, I got a job inside the university, and a college who was interested in that. And basically they realized, right, we call it CPIL, this is a framework that just recognizes that a lot of our faculty, because I work for faculty who are in arts and theater and philosophy, ethics and religious studies, a lot of our faculty are doing amazing research with communities, right, on communities and with communities. And so how can we change the way that we're assessing them and pressuring them and recognize the work that they're doing as excellence? Because it is, they're producing research that we would never even understand if it wasn't with an in community. And so this is one of the ways that we're doing that. I have an amazing colleague who was working on this project before I got to it, and it's so hard to get academics to really value or to be okay with doing this work, because we've been told over and over, like, book, journal, book, journal, book, journal. And so my colleague came up with this way to try to help faculty see that they could change the way they're thinking about it into something that's, into planning it out so that you could see this is actually really excellent work. So he asked those folks to consider their horizon, where they want to see in the next 5 years, the milestones, how will we know that this is something that's working, and then the stepping stones, what are the action steps. So I explained all of that to say, like, okay, this is how I got here, that I finally was like, yeah, you know what, I'm not gonna write another book right now, I'm gonna work with my community, and we're gonna create really awesome research and new knowledge about these things. And so one of the things that I really want to do with my horizon is, right, is that I want to change the narrative of Michigan and the Midwest so that people aren't always asked, where are you really from? Right? How can we make this more inclusive? That we've done the work to make it so that kind of within communities, within our institutions, that we're being more inclusive, right, in our narratives. And so I thought about milestones as I really want to work with state level narratives, like the Michigan History Center is one of my partners, because I think they're really powerful in shaping the narrative. As the state's museum, where many of our students go in 3rd and 4th grade, and that shapes the ideas of what they think is Michigan. I also want to make it so that everyday people can access this information, right? And that gets to one of these projects. And I'm really thinking about young people. How can I get young people in Grand Rapids, in the Midwest, in Michigan, to be able to access this knowledge if it's not a part of their K-12 education, or maybe I make it part of their K-12 education, like the sky's the limit, I feel like. Haven't really developed that one out yet. And so one of these stepping stones, how am I going to get there, is like state historical markers. That's one of the things I can do. And that's the project that we came into together. I also have other ideas on there. So it turns out that I'm also a commissioner for the Michigan History Commission that oversees the state historical marker program. So have you seen these markers before? They're usually around like churches, government buildings, and things like that. So I was on the commission already for a couple years, and I was like, you know what? I actually never looked up the Latino markers for Latino history in Michigan. I should look that up. At the time, there were 2 out of 1,800. There's a number of reasons about the administrator of the program that have changed, that have made it exacerbated things that we're tackling on the commission, but obviously, that's a little disproportionate, right? A little disproportionate. Some things have to do with the funding of markers, of course. Since we started, since we started our project working together, there's been a 3rd one, and this one is actually on the community, by the community. The other are on a Mexican artist who was visiting in Michigan and made some sculptures. In Detroit's Mexican town has a marker that we got last September in a beautiful ceremony and process to get it there. So what I started to think of is, okay, as a historian, I can make this marker really easily because of the way the application is set up. Like, why is it important? Show us the primary and secondary sources that go with this. I have all that because I wrote a book on it. But I didn't want to do it that way, right? I didn't want to do it that way because I got really inspired by some other projects that were happening that were community engaged, grassroots, and collaborative. That is my friend Dora right here. So part of this is in Grand Rapids, they have a really well-developed network of a lot of like first-generation college students turned young professionals who are invested in the community. So they have a Latina network of West Michigan, a Latino network as well as other organizations. And they started doing these community-engaged public history projects already. One of which was Nora taught a class, essentially, in the summer for community members. Right? Something very informal, but still with literature and discussions. Something that really is kept for really the privileged few, right? Who can take college classes. But with this decolonial approach, Nora and collaborators made it so other people could access this information. And from there, the Latino Community Coalition, which had been formed there, created a project called Herencia to honor the histories of Latinos who had passed away. Right, and they were going to make a mural project and rename a street in Grand Rapids. Part of their placemaking is very important for them, so they're trying to change, right, Grand Rapids to include more Latinos. And I was really inspired by this. They invited me to nominate my grandmother as somebody who passed away that they can memorialize. And I was just really amazed by the approach that was centered on collectivism, rather than competition. Because at first they were thinking like, okay, do we just have people apply and then we vote on like whose grandma is the best to go into the mural? Like that feels all bad. And with my like academic training meaning of like, you get a grant, you have to do what the grant says, right? They were like, what do you think we should do? I was like, I don't know, what does your grant say? Like, the grant doesn't say anything, we can do whatever we want. I'm like, oh, then I don't know. Like, I couldn't even think outside of the box. And then they're like, we're gonna do everybody's grant. Anybody who has, applied for this and submitted, we're gonna find a way to honor all of them. And it's been a kind of 2-year process of working and meeting all of these other families who had a loved one pass away and who had this impact on Grand Rapids. And it's created a bond, right, among the families. And I was like, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. I want to give my gifts, my talents, and my resources to this, the skill set that I have to projects like that. And I also just want to recognize that public history, like communities have always done public history in their own way. Families have always done this. It's just not always recognized by our public history institutions and academic institutions. So we started the Latinx Historical Marker Project to set out to make at least 3 markers in the city of Grand Rapids. And I definitely had like, hey, we're gonna do this. We got a plan, and we went in and we changed the plan, right? I was like, this couldn't take that long. And what I learned, right, is that it does take long if you listen to your grassroots community partners and follow their lead, as you should, right? Like, I have these interests, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's gonna help my grassroots partner who's actually on the ground helping the community, right? I'm in this position away from Grand Rapids. I feel like the right thing to do, right, is to follow their lead, and whatever they need help with, they're interested in this public history project. How else can we help with whatever they need? And so we formed a team. So there's Nora, who's here from the Coochie Office of Local History in Grand Rapids. She's the director. We also have from the Latino Community Coalition, Erika, and right there, and Erika Menday, and Veronica Quintino Hernández. Both are trained community organizers, among other host gifts and talents that they have in grant writing and social work writing as a trained social worker as well. And then Steph Rosales, who is the CEO, the director of the Grand Rapids Avenue Arts and Humanities. So we started bringing folks in, kind of one by one. I knew the Latino Community Coalition was somebody I wanted to work with because they did such a good job, with the other one. And Steph knew all of these things about the community because she works directly with them. And Nora's in charge, right, of local history, and that's her charge as director there. And so, with my own interest as an author and historian and somebody wanting to be community engaged, we found that we shared a lot of values. And we also had different connections to one another. For example, Veronica and I went to church together since I was like a baby. I think she knew me when I was a baby. But we've kind of followed each other as we've grown and taken these different career paths. And Nora and I are colleagues in the same field, and we've built a relationship over the years. And Steph, we built relationships with her as I was writing the book. And so we all turned out to be like, okay, we have the shared values of wanting to help the community, of making sure that the community voice leads, and that we support with the resources that we have. We try to be, I think, very cognizant of the power structure. I think for Nora and I, our charges for our jobs include this work, but not everybody's like, Veronica and Erika don't. That's not necessarily their primary function, right? And so whenever we can, we pay them as much as we can with the resources that we have, right? And acknowledging that this is not always equal for everybody. And I think we've done a really good job at resource sharing, where we're kind of getting together like, okay, who's got money in their budget? Who has time? Who has, what we found too is like communications and platform. The Latino Community Coalition has a better pulse of the community and God, Grand Rapids Avenue Arts and Humanities that I could never have. I don't know if you feel this, they have networks that we don't have access to. And so we're sharing resources that are it's not just money, is what I'm trying to say. We also have some kind of institutional partners that we collaborate with when necessary. So I'm also pointing out that we all have a variety of skill sets, right, that we're bringing to this, that you don't have to be a historian to do public history in this way. I think the historians help, but they don't have to always be right there at the center of these things. Michigan History Center is a place that I've cultivated relationships with, as well as the Grand Rapids Public Library, who has been really down for whatever we want to do, and helpful with resources there. So one of the things that we started to do was to make sure, what we realized, I think, is that the process was more important than the product. If the end product that we wanted was a historical marker, the historical marker was our least of our worries, right? We wanted to create a process that was engaged and attentive to what the grassroots leaders were telling us too. So in Grand Rapids, there's also, with the gentrification, rising tension in the neighborhood, and some of it's racial tension that wasn't there before. But it's often predicated on not everybody having the same understanding of the history of this neighborhood. Right, Black folks and Latino folks and some white folks have always been in communication and in community with one another. But your leaders, nonprofit leaders especially, are coming in and seeing it very differently, right? They're seeing their charges helping Latinos only, or this group only, where that's not necessarily how the community has been. And so we really saw, public history as this way of helping people to have a shared understanding of what's happening, not only for the people who are directly affected, but also for the people who need to learn the history of this neighborhood. And maybe not going to read a book, right? Not going to read 205 pages. Who's got time, right, for that? And so while this started out as a marker for, for Latinos, what we were starting to realize is Black folks were very scared that their history in the neighborhood was also going to be erased with this project. And so we were like, we can't do another way, we can't contribute to another group's erasure, so how do we create a process and a marker that attends to all of these histories, even if Latinos have had a prominent presence? How do we make sure that it is a marker reflects the history of all of the people in this group? It's not easy, right? It's not easy. It's not easy, but it's worthwhile, right? So we started to host different programming on this. Group oral histories has been really helpful, and whenever we're doing programs, we're trying to make them the most accessible that we can. From the building structure to can our elders get in the building if they don't have a ramp, if they only have stairs. Is it in Spanish and English if that's necessary? If we have people who are caretaking, can we pay somebody to watch the children in another room here and create things for them to make sure that we can get the maximum participation for those who want it? We've also brought in students with this and trying to move in a way that acknowledges the tension and the histories that are there. These are some of our group oral histories, pictures that we've done with folks over the past year or so. We are always feeding people. We will feed people multiple times. We'll feed breakfast, lunch, dessert, all of these things. Because we know that breaking bread, right, and eating with people, eating with one another, it's really hard to be mad at somebody you just shared a meal with, right? And so you're allowing for people, right, to have a different orientation towards one another. And what they really feel like are celebrations, bringing people together to talk about the history and their shared memories of a place. It's like a reunion, right? It really turned into a reunion. They were singing at some of our last ones, right? When we talked about the history of a church in particular. One of the other ways that we've shifted, according to the needs of the grassroots leaders, is that there's a park being built on the former site of the Catholic church that we're making a memorial for. The church has moved to the suburbs, but it was had such a profound impact on the neighborhood when it was there. We wanted to keep the marker there. Well, there's also a park going up, and there's nervousness about the park and how the park is being framed, what the park is going to be named, who's going to have access to the park with the tension that's happening. And so staff asked if can we please get involved with the Grand Rapids Parks and Recs to help inform on the process and use our history and the community and the networks that we built to help. And we moved to that, right? And so that means the marker, we're getting to the marker, we're finally getting to the marker now. But it's not necessarily what we had to go with, what was the most pressing that the community needed. They didn't necessarily need a marker as much as we needed influence on the process of building and naming the park. We're getting ready for our St. Joseph the Worker marker to do one last community feedback session before we turn in and apply for our marker there. And I'll talk a little bit more about grant funding that we've been able to access in places that we can look for that. I kind of want to move to workshopping some of this stuff and my handouts and all of that. Is that all right with y'all? Okay. I'm gonna hand out some of these, and if you need a pen, raise your hand. Oh, sorry. Oh. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Previously. One of the things that I'm noticing about the way they're talking about this, and I was wondering if you wanted to speak to this a little bit, is this idea of being embedded in a place.
Yeah, because it feels extractive.
Right.
Yeah, you have to be, you better have some investment, a mutual, right? You have to have something, a shared investment in it. Otherwise, it's extractive, right? If you're just coming in and you're not actually, right, working there. I think part of the ways that I'm navigating that is like, is listening to the grassroots, right? Listening to the grassroots leader. Like, what do you need? And I will find a way to use my resources to help with that. Right? Yeah, that's part of
But I
it.
think it's easier for people who like live in the
Yes.
community and that sort of thing to just have that.
Investment. It's already an investment that's already there. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So if you have an idea in mind, if you're thinking about it, I just wanted to offer you a, our framework that we have that we use at the university. This is not necessarily one you need to, but you're like, yeah, there is this really big change that I do want to make or something I do want to be a part of. What's your horizon? Also, I should say that it took me like 2 years to figure out what mine was. I just kept bumping my head, and so I'm not like, if you want to take a note out, you can. I've read the word out, you can. But that's one way when you're ready, you're like, oh my God, I found it. This is what I want to work on. And how will you achieve those things? What external evidence? And then what are actions? So those are just some things, just a reminder of what those words at the top and the bottom of the sheet mean. When you're ready to start thinking about it, and obviously this could be applied, that little framework can be applied to anything. It doesn't have to be public history projects. It could be whatever it is that you're working towards your goal. But if you're here because you're thinking about some project, I wanted to give you at least a little framework to start to think about it. And that brings me to, I want to give a little time to Nora Salas to talk about maybe a project that she's cooking up or thinking about maybe having some legs here.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here, and especially thanks Delia for giving me a few moments to talk about the Cucci Office of Local History and my work with them. My name is Nora Salas. I'm the director of the Cucci Office of Local History at Grand Valley State University. This is my 4th year as the director. I'm also an associate professor of history at Grand Valley, so that's like 50% of my time there. Originally, I'm from Lansing, Michigan. So that is a little bit about me, and we've been one of the partners with this Latinx Historical Marker Project. Our mission at the Cucci office is to sort of promote the underrepresented or underrecognized histories of West Michigan. And the office was started in 2008. I've only been there for 4 years, so there's a lot of other projects that have happened, some of them in Holland years ago that some of you might have heard of. We've done a variety of different activities, collecting oral histories, at times, had events where speakers had come in to talk about these topics, and that kind of thing. A big part of our mission is also the method, right? And so, as a public history office, our method is not for me to do a bunch of research and then come blurt it out in front of people in Holland or Grand Haven or someplace else, right? Our method is to try to help community members act to tell their own history and the history of their community as well. And then we also bring our resources to bear on that. So my resources as a historian, sometimes I get my students involved. That can be another aspect as well. And of course, one of the great things about this is reaching new partners. And that's one of the reasons why I came here today, to possibly reach some new partners for the Latinx Historical Marker Project, but also some other things that we've been working on. Challenges for us as a partner, there's always a resource challenge in any collaborative project. And Delia has talked about that quite a bit. Sometimes for the office there is a challenge between the pace of community work and the pace of university work. And I will say that university work can be very slow. Very, very slow. It is a large bureaucracy. You know the size of Grand Valley, so sometimes it can be like that. There is also sometimes a disconnection because a lot of community work happens when the university's kind of shut down in the summer. And it's a hard pull to convince university professors, who technically are not contracted in the summer, staff who have other projects they put off in the summer, students who are often not around or busy working full-time or more than that in the summer. And so there's a disconnect there oftentimes for us. And then, you have to balance all the partners you already have in those obligations. So this is something that to talk about for a moment one of the other projects that we're working on. And this is a project we call the Teaching West Michigan Histories Project. This is about the third year of the project. And the point of this project is to take some of the resources that we've developed, some of the research that has been done with the community over the past 14 or so years, and other research we know about, and trying to formulate it into something that can be used by classroom teachers. That's the point of the project. And this project exists because when I started my tenure as director of the office, and recently, as you all I think are aware, there's been a lot of controversy about what's taught in the public schools about different groups. But I think we also know that very little is taught about local history just in general, and certainly not about the local history of Latinos or Asian Americans or Native Americans. It's pretty limited. Usually, and I'll take my own example, and I've never had anybody really disagree because I also teach Latino history at Grand Valley, and so I have had a lot of Latino students and other students from West Michigan. In my K-12 education, I learned next to nothing about Latinos, and definitely not if I did. And when students today come and tell me what they learned, it's usually about California or Texas, possibly. But of course, we have our own leads here in Michigan, and it's quite important to me personally, but also the mission of the office, right, is to deal with that. So we wanted to be proactive and say, how can we develop some materials that would take that research that exists, but isn't really accessible to teachers right now? Because we all know teachers are overworked, they don't have time to be looking at a bunch of resources and formatting it for somebody. So that's what we're working on. One of the topics that we have put a little bit of time into is actually the roots of the Mexican and Mexican-American community in Holland, Michigan. And we have a person who did a lot of this research here with us, who is from Holland, Diane Medina, who did not know that I was going to be focusing on. If I had a little spotlight right now, maybe it's going to be important stuff. But we were really lucky to have him as one of our student employees last year. And he was really interested, of course, in the history of the place where he was raised, as a lot of us are. And so we looked up a lot of the types of sources that we have found so far. And actually, I believe he also helped find or made this map about one of the significant places to Mexican or Latino history in Holland, which is the former site of the Holland St. Louis sugar factory, where, and the materials we found so far focus on a group of families that came to work at the Holland St. Louis sugar factory more than a century ago, around 1923. And where the sort of corner was where the location was. I can tell you a little bit more about those people if you're interested in that. But we're still working on this project. I have an example of we have a slideshow that we're working on for teachers that has like the primary sources, we call them, the sources from the time period, and then sort of an explanation of what the sources are. Right now we have the 9 slides similar to this. Jaya found this source for us, working many, many hours in newspaper databases. And we can see, it provides some idea of how people were perceived when they arrived in Holland as Mexicans or Mexican Americans. And this is kind of what we're working on. When we started to find these sources, Diane and I had, because he knew that we had the Latinx Historical Marker Project, conversations along with some of our other staff people, Mary Bulliford, who also works in our office, about, wouldn't it be interesting if there was a historical marker in Holland at the former site of the St. Louis sugar factory, because that is, as far as we know, the site the place where the first Mexicans to come to Holland lived. You know, and I think there are probably, I would say on a personal level, it would have been quite meaningful to me as a child, you know, and Holland does a great job of teaching a lot of its school children about Holland's history, but as a child to see myself reflected in that way. And really in the same sort of time frame as when there were still a lot of Dutch people in Holland who thought of themselves as immigrants and who spoke Dutch and who, for whom that was an important part of their lived experience. You know, so I think, you know, I encounter many students who think from Holland, of that background, who think like maybe the first Mexicans or Latinos to come to Holland came in the 1970s, because that's our family story a lot of times. But it really goes back much farther than that. You know, if we're talking about placemaking and seeing yourself reflected, I think we have a chance here. But as Delia has talked about, right, I would not want to fill out that form myself and get that marker, because that, to me, in a sense, it would be almost pointless, right? I would only want to do it if it was meaningful to people in the community and they wanted to work on it together, right? It's not, that's the process part, is a part of making it significant for the community. So, that is my pitch. I decided not to show the next slide, because I think, yeah, time. Yeah. But if anybody wants to see more of the article, I can send it to you. Let me know. And I'm going to turn it back over to Delia. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. I hope this is what we talk about next. We might be able to see if we have any intersections here that might be able to help to where gauge, community's interest in something like this in other projects. So the sheet that I handed out was like, okay, let me try to make this a little more workshop-y with some strategies, so I could give you something to take away with you. So I wanted to do kind of like a reflective exercise on partner or asset mapping, kind of resource mapping to think about if you're interested in doing a project like this, who might be people, how you might approach it, right? How you might approach something like this. And so I've got these different categories that are, mirrored on the paper there. I'm just gonna go through them a little bit quickly, just to kind of explain, and maybe it's something you can take away, you can jot notes on, or think about it later. So I wanted to make sure we leave time to just talk to at the end. So most of this is gonna, because we're talking about public history projects, it's gonna involve some of the history, right? And so one of the things you might want to take stock of, if this is something that you're interested in doing, is, just knowing what history do we have that's kind of written already or produced already, right? What's our documented history? And it could be by way of secondary sources, what you call, people who have looked at primary sources and synthesized them for us, or larger narratives, or journals, or books, podcasts, documentaries, maybe exhibits at museums, right? Could be part of this. It's like, okay, is there in our community somebody who's already kind of done some of this work that we can use as a base? Or some of the primary sources, so things that were made at the time that you're studying, the time period that you're studying, and so documents, photos, oral histories, material culture, and just kind of thinking about, okay, where are they, who has access to them, are they in libraries, are they in archives, where are there partnerships available with some of those institutions that hold those things, hold those documents, or hold those material culture. And then there's also undocumented history, right? This history that we know that exists, but that lives within our communities, that live with families and individuals. So one is, are there people in the community that have this history that we all know exists? And maybe perhaps the project is around preserving that history and making sure it has a mechanism to stay within the community and be passed down. Things that you want to consider, especially if you're coming from an institution or a place of privilege, right? That if we're talking about histories that sometimes are traumatic, right, for our communities, because it wasn't easy for folks when they got here, that there is a certain trauma to retelling, right, these histories. We want to be cognizant of what we're asking of people and approaching it in reciprocal and respectful ways. And this is often, listening to the people who are affected by it the most and who are closest to it the most. And then community organizations. Community organizations have so much, they contribute so much to these types of projects because of the resources that they have. And again, this is not necessarily money that we're talking about, right? It's networks, it's the knowledge of the community. So do we have relevant community organizations? I don't know, maybe like perhaps, right? Might be interested. And what connections do you have to this organization? is always something. So even if it's not low, but it's another organization that's in Holland that's serving people there. Are there any evidence of these organizations working on projects like this before? In the past, it's always a good sign that they might be open to more. And if not, like, do we have an alignment of goals, right, with what you're thinking of, what your other folks who are invested in this project are thinking of? Does the community organization also have an alignment of goals? So one of the ways that we can think about this, I think, is, for an example, is that I work with a group called LEAD, the Latino Leadership for the Enhancement of Advocacy and Development, I think is what it is. It's LEAD though. It's a group of Latinos, a lot of whom are retirees who are former activists and once they're retirees have like got it back together again and bringing in multiple generations into this. And they're really about advocacy, right? But we've approached them like I have a project about preserving history. We want to create better relationships with the Michigan History Center and Latino communities. This is not necessarily something that they were like. They don't have public history as a part of their goals, but they were like, I feel like this is key to advocacy. You know, like having public history available and accessible to our communities is key to advocacy. We're in, right? We're in. It also helped that one of their leaders is a former librarian. So she was like very excited about this. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like this group is for public history, but do you have something there, alignment there? And then also not being afraid to like, yeah, I came up with this project, but maybe this project was better served if we, adjust in different ways. Institutional partners are also considerations, like museums, like libraries, archives, universities. I got a lot of thoughts on this because institutions haven't always been the best partners, right? They haven't always been the best partners, and we know this. It's a long history. It's a conception of these institutions. A lot of folks have done a really great work to change that narrative, but it's something that I will caution all community members if they're interested in partnering with institutions to really examine your institutional partner to see if you have, they have a track record of doing this work. Are they invested in decolonial approaches of working with the community? So what I mean by that is like, are they invested in, the greater good and not necessarily their own collecting purposes, right? Because that's kind of where the issues stem from, right? To think of possession, right? Possession of artifacts in history. Are they invested in preserving the history no matter what? Right, wherever it is, are they invested in working ethically and responsibly with communities? And if they don't have that stellar record, have they made changes? Are they show a desire to change, a willingness? Are they interested? Can they commit resources to this and to doing better? Are they taking accountability for the past and are willing to say we know we did wrong in the past, but we're interested in changing, and this is how we're doing it. It's just, as somebody who works at an institution and tries to work with an institution, I've seen really unfortunate things happen. And so it's something that I'm cautioned when I want to bring in community partners, right? So let me make sure this institution is going to do right by, right, our communities. So making sure you have shared values, there's resources dedicated to projects like yours. And then if somebody you want to work with, like what are the connections you have? And maybe it's not a direct connection, maybe it's 3 connections, but I'm hoping like events like this help people to, connect and meet people. Also invest in neighbors, right? Invest in neighbors, especially if you're thinking about a place-based project. One of the things that was really important is that we don't just kind of come in and be like, hey, here you guys go, we got this for you. Because that might not be necessarily what the community wants, as Laura has stated, as we've learned. So who would know this? Are there invested neighbors? What are they interested in? How do you make connections with those folks? What goals do the neighbors have, right? And making sure that we're listening to them. And then, of course, considering the power dynamics, right? If you're coming as another community member who's embedded, right, in the community, that's one thing. But if you're coming as somebody with power and resources, making sure that we're listening in a way that's, reciprocal. And then funding. I'll just say a little bit of kind of examples of places that you can think of, right? So I'm thinking for like local, I'm thinking of like the Grand Rapids Foundation was a place that we found to be a partner for funding opportunities. So things at that level. At the state, we have the Michigan Humanities Council that's also grants monies for different projects that are publicly engaged, arts or humanities based. At the, I can't remember what I was thinking of. state or national level, I think sometimes are harder to do on our own because of the way things are set up, but with institutional partners, they're sometimes a little easier to access, but it doesn't mean that it's the only way. The one thing I will say is that we are approaching our 250th anniversary of our country. There's a whole, programmatic effort that's going to be underway and very visible soon, America 250. And with that, there might be more available grants at local and state levels. Institutions might be receiving federal funds to then to distribute. So if you're thinking of a public history project, right now is kind of a good time as we approach 2026. There might be funding available, and so talking with institutions, public history institutions, is a good time to do that now and kind of get a pulse on, what kind of things might they be doing if they were to receive this grant money. And so how to move forward with this? So you're looking to make collaborators, like with people who share the same goals, and looking for also sustainability of a project and trying to work with sustainability in mind. So if working slower means it's more sustainable, then you work slower, and that's okay. I think we try a lot of ways to keep ourselves accountable in our kind of collaboration there. We're kind of constantly assessing and reassessing our capacity. Like, can we do this? When can we do this? When is the time that we could actually, and what does it look like? And we will scale down if we need to, and that's a part of it, right? To make sure we're prioritizing our own health and well-being as well. I think we're really, because we have shared values, it's kind of easy enough to get to a consensus on decision making. If somebody in the group isn't feeling comfortable with something, we're like, tell us why. And like, yes, I see what you're saying, right? It's not a voting situation. It's we're pursuing dialogue and discourse with one another. Checking in on individual needs of the collaborators. So like I said, some of our folks are not working on this as part of their job. So we want to make sure we're paying them as much as we can. And I think folks, the collaborators have been really understanding where I'm like, you guys, I have to keep writing and publicizing this because it's part of my job as the researcher at this research university. Is it okay if I go on this and talk about it? Would anybody like to come? Or sometimes I have to be like, I gotta do this one by myself, and I'm really sorry, but it's a part of what I have to do for my job, and people are understanding of that, right? So making sure that we're thinking about what we all need. And then an openness and willingness to move with the goal, right? If the goal is always to help the community, then we gotta be willing to move with that. So if you're thinking about, okay, what do I do now? I have a project I'm thinking about. Inventory mapping is a good step, right? Really taking a good look at some of those things and others that you might need. Assessing the needs and willingness of partners and collaboration partners. Discussing various goals and checking for alignment. Are these people that we can work with? And then, mapping out what does it look like to get us to maybe one of these stepping stones or milestones there. I think on the next, I just have, there's a couple books if you really like reading. There's a couple books, Working in Comunidad is a new book on how to work with community-engaged projects with Latinos and Latino communities. There's the Public Historian, it's a journal. And then maybe you or something's out there thinking of the digital, because there's a lot of digital projects and web-based projects. That are another book to consider. And there's other examples, like the Southwest Detroit marker is one of those. I can share links if people are interested. There's also a website, another digital project. Chicana por mi Casa is a website that looks at the kind of the history of Chicanas that has a really big focus on Michigan. And that's a really, really amazing project. And then Herencia, the project that's happening in Grand Rapids, are other examples. But that's it. I think we got some time to talk a little. That's okay with you all. Thank you. I think Lauren has a microphone.
Can everybody hear me? So I have a microphone as well, so if anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand, and that way everybody can hear your question. I just want to say thank you guys. Those were wonderful. You did a wonderful job. I appreciate you guys coming down, and I think you gave us a lot of really wonderful ideas. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's not really a question, it's more so to say thank you for the work that you're doing. I loved meeting you, we loved hearing your story. I know as a staff and board here at Level, we loved having you at the Land Experience Symposium, for writing other partners. It's great to meet you. I'm Julian, I serve as the Director of Youth Programs here, and so I think it's so important that our stories are told. That's why I continue to push representation for our youth so that they see themselves reflected in the community and everything that we do. And I'll definitely pitch these projects to Johnny, who's a leader, and have him follow up with you on that if this is something he's interested in. So thank you.
Yes, definitely. I think Nora is probably going to be our Holland as we branched out from Grand Rapids to Holland. And if folks are interested, it seems it's the right thing to do, right? It's the right thing to do that we don't have a way to memorialize, right, the long presence of folks here. We're missing out on opportunities to really re-inform, right? Inform who Holland is in a more inclusive way. And that is going to be so meaningful, as Nora said, as you remarked, like the youth have played this really important role. So one of the things that we also think about is the marker, right? So we have this process to get the marker that's really important. But then once you have the marker, that's when the other work starts too, right? And then there's programming around the marker. How do we get people to engage with the context in the marker in other ways that are meaningful, that can be tailored to particular groups of people, especially young people? That'd be so cool. That'd be so cool, yes.
I was so surprised that it was the sugar factory at hospital. That was the first.
Here.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things we found in the research too is that Heinz is later, right? That's in the 1990s. Yeah, that's a little later. And there's also, one of the reasons why this is not, I think, better known is there's kind of a little gap, right? So there's these people and they come and work for the Holland St. Louis Sugar Company in the 1920s, and then the sugar company shuts down during the Great Depression time period. And during that time period, there was also a really significant effort to deport Mexicans and Mexican Americans, both. So a lot of people left Michigan, and so it's possible. I don't think we know right now really if this is a continuous presence or a time period in the 1920s, and then there's sort of like a gap. And then we know for sure there's more people that come in the 1940s, right, World War II time period, because of course the story of Mexican immigration to the Midwest is sort of, we really want people to come in the 1920s because there's this great need. I don't know why, but if you want. And then in the 1930s, it's, afuera, like, basically. And then during World War II, the need is just enormous. And so then they're saying, come as many people as possible to work. So, yeah. So I think a part of the, maybe not awareness is that it's possible that none of those people from the 20s have descendants today in Holland. It's also possible they do, and we just don't know yet.
Was there segregation in the factory itself? You know,
Yeah, that's a good question.
It would be a really cool project to learn more about and to work on. If there was anybody who maybe wanted to volunteer and work on archive stuff.
Yeah, so I think going off of that, if we have folks who are interested in getting started with a project like this, what are the next steps? What should we be doing?
Contacting, right?
Yeah,
Contacting
I
such
can
a
give my card and we can talk about it, and I think Delia can come in as needed.
Yeah. I think we kind of lose collaboration, and we help where where necessary. But I think definitely getting in touch with Nora and so that we can take that inventory, right? And who we have, who's willing and able, and this, what gifts and talents and skills can you bring to help with this? And I think that's. I hope you see that from this, you need a lot of different talents and skill sets, right? It's not just history skill sets, right? These formal training, there's so many other things that go into these projects.
And some of the things that would be nice to have.
You would say it in the mic, so you can
Yes. Some of the things that would be nice to have might not even be what you expect. So, like, I would dearly love to identify somebody who can read Dutch, to read the Dutch newspapers from the 20s and see if they're saying anything about the workers. Because I actually opened up the database and looked at it. I cannot read Dutch. But shockingly, I cannot. But there's definitely articles in some of those newspapers where they're talking about like current events in Mexico and Latin America. It's sort of like international news from places where I might find somebody who could read Dutch who might want to contribute. I just have an inkling this year. And so, yeah, and I mean, the Holland Museum has all of these papers online.